Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking on something huge, a complex, politically charged, and just deeply human story from the heart of Central America.
We're tackling the Nicaraguan Revolution.
And this isn't a single event. It's this long, drawn-out conflict that really stretches across generations. It defined the Cold War in the Americas, and, its legacy is still shaping politics right now.
Exactly. And our mission today is pretty specific. We're going through the sources, the articles, diplomatic cables, all the historical analysis, and we're going to try and synthesize it. We want to build a structured understanding of this monumental struggle.
Yeah, because this is so much more than just Sandinistas versus Contras.
Oh, absolutely. It's about figuring out how a dictatorship that lasted for decades was finally dismantled and, what the incredibly high cost of that transition really was.
And when you say decades-old dictatorship, we're talking about the Somoza family dynasty.
Yeah.
That's really the main outcome of the whole revolution, isn't it?
It is. The overthrow of a family that held power, and I mean like absolute power, from the 1930s all the way to 1979.
It's just staggering. And their rule was a blend of official government and just outright gangsterism.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It was defined by systemic corruption, by violence, and by this profound, profound inequality.
And this is so essential for you, the listener, to grasp right from the start.
Yeah.
This was never just a local fight. It wasn't just contained within Nicaragua's border.
It's not even close. It was intensely, almost tragically influenced by the global Cold War. It became one of the most visible proxy battlegrounds between the Soviet Union and the United States.
And that completely reframed the politics of the entire region, didn't it?
It did. It drastically impacted U.S.-Latin American relations and set these precedents for intervention and isolation that, honestly, you can still see traces of well into the 21st century.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we really want to understand that revolutionary moment in 1979, we have to spool the tape way back.
Way back. You have to go back to the origins of this anti-authoritarian feeling in the 1920s, which was, at its core, all rooted in foreign intervention.
Right. For Nicaragua, the early 20th century was just. It was marked by constant interference from the U.S.
Constant. You had a series of military interventions, U.S. Marines being deployed to, secure American economic interests or to stabilize political situations that Washington didn't like.
And that constant foreign presence, I imagine, just created this massive groundswell of resentment, of nationalism.
And out of that resentment rose the first real symbol of resistance, a figure whose name would eventually inspire the entire revolutionary movement.
Augusto Cesar Sandino.
Exactly. He is absolutely central to this whole story. And he wasn't just some, random rebel. He was a self-taught, sophisticated guerrilla commander who led this sustained campaign specifically against the U.S. occupation force.
And that was from the late 1920s into the early 30s, right?
That's right. His story isn't just about the fighting, though. It's about him establishing a political philosophy.
So what was the core of that? What made Sandino's legacy so potent decades later?
His core message was unwavering sovereignty. He defined himself as the defender of Nicaragua's right to self-determination. He refused, flat out, to lay down his arms until the very last U.S. Marine left Nicaraguan soil.
And his tactics were pretty effective.
Incredibly. He used tactics that were perfect against a conventional military force, small, mobile units fighting from the mountains, really difficult terrain. And his success, despite the U.S. having this overwhelming technological and material advantage, is what turned him into a legend.
So he really came to embody resistance to imperialism.
He did. He became the foundational ideological icon for what would later become the Front Descendientes de Liberación Nacional, the FSLN.
So Sandino's fight eventually forces the U.S. hand. They plan a withdrawal in the early 1930s. But they can't just leave a power vacuum.
Right. And Washington, trying to manage this, helped create an institution that was designed to maintain order after they left. And that institution is the one that ultimately betrayed Sandino and really the whole nation.
The Guardia Nacional.
Yeah.
The National Guard.
Precisely. The Guardia Nacional was formed with intensive U.S. training, with U.S. assistance. And the idea, on paper, was to create a nonpartisan professional military force to keep the peace.
But that's not what happened.
Not at all. This body, which was designed to be apolitical, it rapidly transformed into the loyal, brutal military and institutional muscle of the rising Somoza family.
And it was that institution, the Guardia Nacional, that murdered Sandino in 1934.
Yes. That murder paved the way for Anastasio Somoza Garcia to seize total control.
He was the head of the Guard, right?
He was. He used his control over the Guardia Nacional to eliminate his biggest rival, Sandino, and by doing that, he cemented his own power. That was the real beginning of the dynasty, a dynasty that would rule for over 4 decades, from the mid-30s until the very last Somoza fell in 1979.
That is just an astonishing run of power for one family in one country. How did they pull it off? Was it just pure brute force for 40-plus years?
It was a bit more sophisticated than that. It was a dual strategy. On one hand, they kept up the facade of formal elections and constitutional government.
They went through the motions.
We went through the motions, yeah. Sometimes rotating the presidency between family members or, trusted allies. That was to keep international observers happy.
Yeah.
But under that really thin veneer of legality, they enforced absolute authoritarian control.
And that was sustained by corruption and violence?
Corruption, systemic violence, and a system that was designed from the ground up for massive personal enrichment. They didn't just rule Nicaragua, they owned Nicaragua.
Let's get into the specifics of that economic control, because that seems to be the root of all the resentment. When we say the Somozas were rich, what did that actually mean? What did they own?
The sources are pretty clear on this. By the 1960s and 70s, the Somoza family controlled just an astronomical share of the national wealth. They didn't just collect taxes, they controlled the most profitable levers of the economy.
Okay, so what are we talking about here?
We're talking about huge tracts of agricultural land, especially for the big export crops like cotton and coffee. They owned the national airline, the merchant shipping fleet, the construction firms that got all the big infrastructure projects, even the National Cement Company.
Wow. So if you needed to build something, transport something, or export something, you were paying the Somozas.
Absolutely. They had monopolies or dominant positions in all these key sectors. And what that meant was that even the established business sector, conservative elites who were theoretically on the same anti-communist page as Somoza, even they felt suffocated.
And this structure, it just created this massive gap between the rich and poor.
A chasm. A tiny elite. The family and their closest allies benefited immensely, while the vast majority of the population, especially rural poor and urban workers, lived in appalling poverty. The average person could literally see the nation's wealth draining into one family's offshore bank accounts.
And their diplomatic shield against any criticism during all this was, predictably, the Cold War.
It was their lifeline. The regime was fiercely anti-communist, which made them a reliable ally for the United States, especially as revolutionary movements started gaining steam elsewhere in Latin America.
So Washington just looked the other way.
They did more than that. This anti-communist stance got them massive military and economic support from the U.S., which basically gave them a license to operate without any real scrutiny of their human rights abuses or their corruption. Washington saw Somoza as a strategically necessary bulwark against communism. Democratic concerns just didn't factor in.
So that brings us back to the Guardian National. The instrument of power wasn't just a military, it was the mechanism for enforcing that whole economic system. How did the population see them?
They were hated. Profoundly, almost universally hated. They weren't seen as protectors. They were seen as occupiers and enforcers for the Somoza family. They were the ones suppressing dissent, maintaining order through fear, and protecting the family's business interests.
And they operated with impunity.
Total impunity. Their actions against rural workers, students, political opponents. It ensured that the military became completely synonymous with the dictatorship's cruelty.
Given that level of poverty and corruption and state violence, the opposition couldn't have just been some fringe revolutionary group. The sources really emphasize how widespread the resistance was.
And that's a crucial point. This wasn't just a revolution by the left. The anti-Somoza front became a truly national coalition.
So who was in it?
You had the traditional political elites, the old conservative parties who felt pushed aside by the Somozas. You had the established business sectors who were sick of the family's monopolies. You had the Catholic Church, which was a very powerful conservative voice.
Then the more radical groups.
And then, of course, you had the foundational base of student and worker movements and the radical left-wing groups. But they were all united, no matter how different their ultimate goals were, by one thing.
Ending the regime.
A desperate desire to end the regime's corruption and its abuses.
It sounds like the country was just loaded, a perfect storm of social frustration, class tension, all of it, just waiting for one event to break the dam.
It was, but that dam needed a critical rupture point. And historically, that point wasn't a political event. It was a natural disaster that forced everything out into the open.
The 1972 Managua earthquake.
That's where we go next. A natural disaster that became a complete moral disaster for the regime.
The earthquake just leveled the capital city, right?
It was devastating. Managua was almost completely destroyed. The human cost was immense. But it was the regime's response that turned this tragedy into a festering political wound.
How so?
International aid just poured into the country. Money, supplies, materials, and almost immediately that reconstruction effort was just plagued by theft, diversion,
Ugh.
spectacular open corruption.
Anastasio Somoza de Boyle, the last dictator, he basically treated the relief fund as his own personal bank account.
He did. And this level of corruption during a humanitarian crisis, literally stealing aid money meant for the homeless and the injured, that was the ultimate erosion of legitimacy.
You can maybe tolerate a dictator in peacetime, but not one who profits from your suffering.
Precisely. The blatant mismanagement and corruption just exposed the government's utter contempt for its own people. It shattered whatever moral or political legitimacy Somoza had left, both at home and internationally. Aid organizations started asking where their money was going, and domestic business leaders, even the ones who hated the left, they were appalled.
The stage was set for a revolutionary movement to step into that void.
And the primary revolutionary group stepping forward was, of course, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, the FSLN, building on that legacy of Sandino.
They'd been around for a while at this point, though.
Oh, yeah. The FSLN was established back in 1961 by giants of the movement like Carlos Fonseca Amador and Tomás Borges Martínez, but their early years were incredibly difficult.
What were they doing in the 60s?
They were small, they were radical, and they were focused on these disorganized rural uprisings that the Guardia Nacional just brutally and efficiently crushed, and this forced a critical strategic shift.
They had to change their approach.
Yeah. They realized they had to abandon that purely rural focus and concentrate on rebuilding their social bases among students, intellectuals, and the working class in the cities.
So the 1972 earthquake didn't create the FSLN, but it gave them the critical momentum they needed to go from being a small ideological group to a major popular force.
Absolutely. The chaos after 1972 was the perfect breeding ground. The movement gained what the sources describe as unusual strength. They diversified their tactics. They realized they needed high-profile, attention-grabbing actions, not just small-scale skirmishes.
So what did that look like?
This included kidnappings of government officials, targeted bombings, and strategic operations that were designed to do three things at once: get international media attention, seize resources they desperately needed, and rapidly recruit all these disillusioned citizens. They had to show they could hit Somoza where it hurt.
But if we look closely at the FSLN during this period, it wasn't, a unified, single-minded force, was it? This is where the political theory of the revolution gets really fascinating.
It is, and this is a critical nuance, something that really separates a deep dive from a general history. The FSLN was not a solid, monolithic organization. It was made up of three distinct ideological factions, or tendencias, that often had competing views on how to fight the revolution and what the future should even look like.
And the fact that they could eventually cooperate was key to their success.
It was everything.
Okay, so let's detail these three blueprints for Nicaragua's future. What were the core beliefs of these factions?
We can break them down pretty clearly. First, you had the Guerra Popular Prolongada faction, the GPP. This was heavily influenced by Maoist thinking.
The Chinese model.
Exactly. They believed in a long, sustained rural guerrilla campaign. Prioritize organizing the peasants, slowly encircle the cities. They saw the revolution as a decades-long war of attrition fought mostly in the mountains.
And the second group.
The second was the Tendencia Proletaria. This was your classic Marxist-Leninist faction. They actually criticized the GPP's focus on the rural areas. They argued that the real engine of revolution was the urban working class and organized labor.
So they were focused on the cities.
Right. Industrial organizing, building alliances in Managua and León. They wanted a more immediate, politically sophisticated confrontation, not some long, patient war.
Two very different revolutionary timelines there. Which brings us to the third group, the one that ultimately proved to be the most politically effective.
That would be the Tendencia Tercerista, or the insurrectional tendency. This was a left-wing nationalist faction. And they were, you could argue, the most pragmatic and broad-based.
How so?
They saw the revolution not just as a class struggle, but fundamentally as a national liberation movement against the Somoza tyranny and U.S. influence. Their appeal was much broader. They welcomed non-Marxists, intellectuals, even disillusioned business leaders who were just desperate to get rid of the dictatorship.
And it was the Tercerista faction that produced the leader who would eventually define the whole movement.
Yes, Daniel Ortega was a key leader in the Tercerista faction, and their strategy insurrection, massive civilian mobilization, building alliances across class lines, that was the blueprint that proved most successful in those final years.
And that's why their initial vision after winning was so focused on things like pluralism and a mixed economy.
Exactly. It was the Tercerista blueprint winning out over the stricter Marxist-Leninist approaches.
Now, beyond their own internal unity, they needed external resources to even think about matching Somoza's U.S. backing. Who really stepped up to help the FSLN?
Cuba was crucial, providing training, ideological guidance, experienced military advisors. But they also got tangible support from some non-communist sources.
Like who?
Leaders like Omar Torrijos in Panama and Carlos Andrés Pérez in Venezuela, who was the head of a social democratic party, they provided weapons, resources, and diplomatic cover.
So that diverse external support was vital.
It was. It meant the FSLN wasn't completely reliant on the Soviet orbit, and that reinforced the Tercerista claim that this was a nationalist revolution, not just another Soviet proxy war.
So the coalition is built, the factions have sort of agreed on a strategy, and external support is flowing in. We just need that final spark to ignite the national uprising. We're moving into 1978 now.
And the final catastrophic breaking point came in January 1978, the assassination of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro Cardinal.
Chamorro was such a critical and complex figure. He wasn't a Sandinista, he was a conservative, the owner and editor of La Prensa, the main opposition newspaper.
Exactly. He was the most important voice of the legitimate non-Sandinista opposition.
Yeah.
A conservative Democrat, but his newspaper fearlessly exposed Somoza's corruption. And when he was murdered, the public immediately and correctly blamed the regime.
So how did the FSLN manage to harness the outrage over the death of a conservative leader, given that ideological distance?
Chamorro's death was the ultimate galvanizing event because it proved that no one was safe under Somoza. Not the rural peasant, not the urban worker, and not the educated established elite. His murder caused this unprecedented national commotion.
The sources describe mass protests, general strikes.
The country was paralyzed. And the anti-Somoza coalition just swelled beyond belief. You had the conservative business community, professionals, the entire spectrum of the Catholic Church. They all joined forces with the students and the FSLN.
And the FSLN positioned itself as the only group that could actually do something.
They skillfully positioned themselves as the only force capable of enacting the change that all these different groups were now demanding.
And capitalizing on that unified anger, they needed a symbolic act of defiance to prove they could actually beat the regime militarily.
That brings us to one of the most dramatic operations of the entire revolution, the August 1978 takeover of the National Palace in Managua.
The Legislative Palace.
The Legislative Palace. This operation, led by Eden Pastora, a huge figure in the Tercerista faction, was just audacious. The guerrillas stormed the palace and took up to 2,000 people hostage, including a lot of government officials and deputies.
2,000 people, that's astonishing. What was the demand?
Simple. Money, safe passage out, and most importantly, the release of key political prisoners, including figures like Tomás Borges. The sheer scale and success of it was a massive public relations coup.
It forced Somoza to negotiate.
It did. It showed that the FSLN could strike at the very heart of his power structure. It galvanized the population, it made international headlines, and it immediately led to open, armed uprisings spreading like wildfire across the country.
The domino effect had begun. City after city, Leon, Masaya, Esteli, they erupted and began to fall to Sandinista forces through late 78 and into 79.
And the Guardia Nacional, once seen as invincible, was now fighting a desperate and losing battle against a totally mobilized population.
So by the summer of 1979, the end was in sight.
The end was inevitable. The last of the U.S. diplomatic efforts to broker some kind of compromise government failed. The armed opposition, now broadly united, had just proven too powerful.
And after 45 years of continuous dynastic rule, the Somoza era finally ended.
On July 17, 1979, the dictator Anastasio Somoza Debayle resigned and fled the country, first to Miami, then into exile in Paraguay. And just 48 hours later, on July 19th, Sandinista forces entered Managua to these huge celebrations. They received the surrender of the last National Guard units. The revolution was won.
Now the hard part starts, building a new government. They formed a provisional national reconstruction junta. What was its political makeup?
The junta was designed to project unity and pluralism, to reflect that broad coalition that had won the war. So while it was dominated by the FSLN, it intentionally included respected non-Sandinista figures, representatives from the business community, from the intelligentsia.
And that was crucial for getting international support.
Crucial. It secured immediate, wide national and international support. The goal was revolutionary, but also pragmatic. They wanted a mixed economy, political pluralism, an end to inequality, and above all, to reduce their dependence on the United States. They didn't want to become another Cuba. They were aiming for something distinctly Nicaraguan.
And the government immediately moved to enact some pretty radical social change, really focusing on that deep inequality left over from the Somoza era.
They did, and the sources highlight three immediate monumental undertakings. First, a massive agrarian land reform program.
So all the Somoza family's property.
All of it. The vast properties, businesses, assets controlled by the Somoza family and its allies were immediately nationalized. This was a huge portion of the nation's wealth, and it was redistributed to peasants and cooperatives. It immediately began to address that century-old land disparity.
But the reform that really captured the world's imagination was the literacy campaign.
Absolutely. The 1980 Literacy Crusade was maybe the revolution's most symbolic and impactful early success. The government mobilized thousands of university students, teachers, volunteers, they called them brigadistas, and sent them deep into the rural areas where illiteracy was incredibly high. They saw illiteracy itself as a form of tyranny left over from the dictatorship.
And what was the measurable impact of that campaign?
Staggering. Before the revolution, the illiteracy rate was hovering around 50%. After the campaign, which lasted about 5 months, it dropped dramatically. It plunged below 13%.
Wow.
It was recognized globally by UNESCO and just showed this profound commitment to social uplift. And at the same time, they were implementing a major expansion of nationwide health services, bringing basic care and vaccination programs to rural areas that the Somozas had completely ignored.
But this moment of intense idealism and social transformation,
Yeah.
it was incredibly short-lived.
It was. That vision of equity was curtailed almost immediately by the counter-revolution,
A contrast.
the emergence of the Contra-insurgency. The word Contra is short for Contra-Revolutionarios, counter-revolutionaries, and their formation began almost before the dust had settled in Managua.
So who exactly were the Contras? What was their core?
The core leadership and the early fighting force of the Contras were formed primarily by ex-members of the hated Guardia Nacional.
The old guard.
Literally. These were the men who had lost their power, their positions, their ability to operate with impunity when Somoza fell. They quickly set up bases in neighboring Honduras and Costa Rica, and they were soon joined by deeply conservative sectors, landowners, wealthy business people who were just fundamentally opposed to the FSLN's social revolution.
They hated the land reforms and the nationalization.
Hated them, and this is where the Cold War influence returns with a vengeance. The Contras only became a major sustained threat because they had the backing of a superpower.
Right. By 1981, Ronald Reagan is elected in the United States, and that backing becomes explicit and massive.
The U.S. administration began actively organizing, financing, training, and arming the Contra forces. This transformed them from a disorganized band of exiles into a formidable, sustained fighting force.
What was the rationale driving the Reagan administration?
Yeah.
Why commit so heavily to overthrowing a government that, had started out with broad international support and was running popular literacy campaigns?
The rationale was purely ideological and geopolitical. The U.S. didn't view the Sandinista government through the lens of Nicaragua's local needs. They saw it through the lens of global ideological conflict.
They feared a second Cuba.
A second Cuba in Central America, a domino that could potentially destabilize El Salvador and Guatemala, where similar brutal civil conflicts were raging. For Washington, the Sandinistas were a cancerous part that needed to be surgically removed to stop the spread of Soviet influence. The Contras became the instrument of that pressure, designed to destabilize, harass, and ultimately overthrow the FSLN.
And their operational bases in Honduras and Costa Rica meant they were waging a border war. What were their main tactics?
Their strategy was fundamentally destructive. They tended to avoid conventional battles against the new Sandinista army. Instead, they focused on economic targets and civilian infrastructure.
So they're trying to cripple the country.
Exactly. They constantly attacked state farms, power plants, the health clinics the FSLN had built, the schools the FSLN had built, roads. The goal was to undermine the legitimacy of the Sandinista government by proving it couldn't guarantee peace, security, or economic stability for its own citizens. It was a strategy of attrition designed to cripple the economy and alienate the population.
Which means that within 2 years of winning their revolution, Nicaragua was plunged into a second brutal civil war. the war against the Contras.
It's a critical distinction for you, the listener, to understand. They spent the 1980s fighting for survival, not just for reform.
And it's the defining tragedy of the 1980s for Nicaragua. They had to shift from being a government focused on social programs, like that amazing literacy campaign, to a government focused almost entirely on massive war expenditures and military defense.
And that shift just compounded all the challenges they were already facing in trying to build a new state.
This conflict devastated the economy, making the crisis they inherited from Somoza just exponentially worse. Let's look at the specific mechanisms here. It wasn't just the cost of the war itself.
No, it was a multi-front assault on the Nicaraguan economy, a layered disaster. First, you had the explicit geopolitical pressure. The U.S. imposed severe economic sanctions and a comprehensive commercial embargo.
Which cut them off from their primary trading partner.
Completely. It cut them off from the vast U.S. market, and it cut off crucial access to American technology and spare parts. That strangled key industries almost overnight. Second, you had the massive unsustainable war expenditures. The Sandinista government was forced to put nearly half its national budget into defense, into fighting the Contras.
Which starved the social services.
Starved them. Third, the constant infrastructure damage from Contra attacks, destroying bridges, blowing up power lines, burning crop storage facilities that directly hit production and distribution. And finally, you had declining export profits due to global market shifts on top of all that.
And what was the day-to-day impact for an average family in Nicaragua? We're not just talking about numbers on a spreadsheet.
No, we're talking about catastrophic social and economic fallout. This combination of pressures led to severe hyperinflation. Prices spiraled out of control, eroding the value of the currency and people's life savings.
And shortages.
Chronic, acute shortages of basic products, food staples, medicine, necessary imported goods. People spent enormous amounts of time just queuing for essential supplies. And that economic instability severely damaged the Sandinista government's credibility and its influence at home. Regardless of your revolutionary ideals, if the government can't feed its people, it loses its mandate.
But even while they were under siege and facing this economic meltdown, the FSLN made a commitment to institutionalizing their power through the democratic process. They held elections in 1984.
This was a critical moment for Sandinista legitimacy. In the middle of a brutal civil war, the government held general elections. Daniel Ortega won the presidency, the FSLN secured control of the legislative palace, and they used this to draft a new constitution, enshrining the goals of the revolution.
But the results were highly controversial, especially in the U.S. and among some of their domestic opponents. What was the verdict on the legitimacy of that '84 election?
It's a contested historical point. Some key opposition groups, particularly those backed by the U.S., boycotted the process. They claimed it was unfair and predetermined.
But international observers saw it differently.
Many did. It's essential to note that numerous international observers, including groups from Europe and Latin America, concluded that despite the wartime context and the limitations on resources, the 1984 elections were conducted cleanly and were representative of the will of the people who participated. The controversy really just highlights how polarized the conflict was. If the result was favorable to the FSLN, Washington was inevitably going to call it illegitimate.
As the decade wore on, fighting this massive U.S.-funded war while managing a collapsing economy, it just became unsustainable. And the sources show this crucial turning point where regional leaders realized the fighting just had to stop.
Regional exhaustion became the engine for peace. By the late 1980s, the conflicts in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala had bled the entire region dry. And this necessity for stability finally crystallized in the Esquipulas II Accord in 1987.
So explain the Esquipulas II Accord. What did it mandate?
This was a landmark agreement signed by the presidents of all 5 Central American nations, and it called for 3 major commitments across the region: immediate democratization, ceasefires in all active civil conflicts, and formal negotiations with insurgent groups.
So the goal was to take the Cold War framework out of it and prioritize political solutions.
That was the goal, to prioritize political, not military solutions. And this accord put immense pressure directly on Ortega and the FSLN. They were now obligated by a regional agreement to adhere to strict democratic principles, even while they were still fighting the Contras.
And that tension was the final pivot.
It was. To comply with the treaty and to try and secure stability, Ortega made the massive political decision to call for new elections to be held in 1990, and he took extraordinary steps to guarantee they would be fair.
He allowed full opposition participation, invited extensive international monitoring,
He wanted a result that would be unimpeachable on the world stage.
And the result of the February 1990 election was one of the biggest political upsets of the century.
It truly was a political earthquake. The opposition coalition, the National Opposition Union, or UNO, they secured a stunning victory. Their presidential candidate, Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, defeated Daniel Ortega and the FSLN.
That is so deeply symbolic. Violeta Chamorro was the widow of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, whose assassination in 1978 triggered the final uprising.
It was. Her victory tied the democratic opposition right back to the revolution's starting point. It was a powerful symbolic act of reconciliation and closure for many Nicaraguans.
But the most historically significant outcome wasn't the victory itself. It was the transition that came after.
That's right. Despite the immense shock and the pressure, the FSLN leadership, in an act that garnered immense international praise and surprise, peacefully handed over power to the newly elected opposition.
And that peaceful transition, which is a genuine shock to many who assumed the Sandinistas would just cling to power, that formally ended the period of wide-scale armed conflict.
Yes, the war officially ended. The sources confirm the Contras immediately halted their actions and began to demobilize. They had achieved their goal of removing the Sandinistas from power, but through democratic means.
So the revolution achieved its goal, the end of the dictatorship. It successfully transitioned to a political solution in 1990. But the FSLN did not just disappear. What happened next?
No, despite the electoral loss, the Frente Sandinista remained the single most significant political force in the country. They kept their organizational structure, their vast institutional memory, and most importantly, they kept their deep, dedicated grassroots support among the rural and urban poor who had benefited from those initial reforms. They became the effective opposition.
And the return of Daniel Ortega in 2007 signaled the resurrection of the Sandinista project, even if it was a very different one.
Correct. After more than a decade in opposition, the FSLN, under Ortega, successfully returned to power in 2007. And he has maintained control since then, still holding the presidency today, as of the sources we're using.
Which speaks to the enduring resonance of the Sandinista legacy in Nicaraguan political identity.
It does. But the critical paradox here, maybe the great tragedy of the revolution's legacy, is the comparison between the FSLN's initial goals in 1979 and the nature of the government that Ortega runs today.
It's a stark contrast.
A stark contrast. The Sandinista movement of 1979 aimed for democracy, for pluralism, for reduced inequality through popular mobilization. But Ortega's subsequent governments have been increasingly accused of employing authoritarian practices.
Consolidating power, eliminating opposition voices.
Controlling institutions like the Supreme Court and the Electoral Council, severely restricting civil liberties.
So the movement that fought to overthrow one dictator has, in the eyes of many, evolved into a new form of entrenched authoritarianism.
And that is the defining contradiction. This modern authoritarian trend stands in profound opposition to the pluralistic, democratic aspirations that the Tercerista faction and the revolution itself preached in the 1980s. It highlights the transformation of a revolutionary vanguard into an entrenched political establishment.
Often sacrificing democratic ideals in the pursuit of maintaining power.
Exactly.
When you connect all these dots, from the 1920s interventions, the Somoza monopolies, Sandino, the FSLN factions, the U.S. counterinsurgency, and the eventual political transition, you see a process driven by this unbelievably complex intersection of forces.
It was layered. You have the social dynamics, for sure, but also intense ethnic tensions, class conflict, regional friction, all of it just amplified and weaponized by being placed within the dramatic framework of the Cold War. To really understand Nicaragua, you have to appreciate all those elements pulling at the country at the same time.
And we should always circle back to those initial early gains of the revolution, even though the trajectory shifted so dramatically.
We should. Those initial achievements in literacy and the expansion of national health services were massive, tangible improvements in the quality of life for the poorest Nicaraguans during that early revolutionary period. They represent what the FSLN could achieve when it was focused on social transformation.
It's such a complex legacy.
The revolution successfully achieved its primary, visceral goal. It removed the dictatorship. But the subsequent decade-long struggle against external forces and internal instability ultimately undermined its initial political vision. It forced the transition from an armed struggle to this highly volatile, politicized struggle for institutional control.
This has been a monumental deep dive. We started with the foundation of resistance under Sandino. We detailed the structural corruption of the Somoza dynasty, the monopolies over land, industry, commerce, and analyzed the critical tipping points like the '72 earthquake and Chamorro's assassination.
We then explored the complexity of the FSLN itself. identifying the three key ideological factions, GPP, Proletaria, and Tercerista. And we saw how the Contras, fundamentally composed of the old Guardia Nacional and financed by the U.S., drove the economic collapse of the 1980s.
And finally, we looked at that peaceful transition in 1990 under the Esquipulas Accords and the subsequent paradoxical return of the FSLN under Daniel Ortega in 2007, now accused of the very authoritarianism they once fought against.
And what's so fascinating here is how those external forces shaped the internal reality. The Nicaraguan Revolution achieved its primary, necessary goal, regime change, but found its subsequent vision just crippled by this geopolitical struggle.
Which leads us to a crucial final question for you to consider as you reflect on this history.
If the FSLN's original goal was democratic and pluralistic, but they were immediately faced with massive, internationally financed military pressure and economic warfare, was their subsequent shift toward authoritarianism a necessity for survival? Or did the U.S. pressure on the Sandinistas ultimately force them to become the very regime they claimed they were fighting against, thus guaranteeing a cycle of instability? It's a question of agency versus environment, and it's one that is still being answered in Nicaragua today.